Masechet Baba Kama Daf Yod Bet. Today we're talking about the status of slaves. Are they like land or not like land? And also with regard to collecting a loan by taking someone's slaves. We left off yesterday with a machloket. Ula said in the name of Rabbi Elazar that let's say someone owes me money and they die, and that person has slaves. Rabbi Elazar says I am allowed to go to the orphans and collect the slaves in payment of my loan, just like I would be able to do for land. So slaves are like land. Whereas Rav Nachman said, no, you cannot do that. And in fact, Ula waited till Rav Nachman left the room before he repeated this in the name of Rabbi Elazar, because he knew that Rav Nachman disagreed with him. And so according to Rav Nachman, slaves are not like land. And yes, I could go after the land, wherever it is, even if someone else bought it or it went to the inheritors. But for slaves, I cannot. I can go to the person himself, the person that owes me money. I can take anything of his, even the shirt off his back, even movable items, if slaves, land, that person himself. But in terms of having a lien, only land, according to Rav Nachman, has a lien that I can go after the buyer or the orphans. But slaves, according to Rav Nachman, are not like land, they are like movable items. Okay, now with that in mind, we have some stories. There was an incident exactly like this where someone else owed someone money and that the borrower died, and then the lender went and collected slaves from the orphans. Another same story happened in Pumbedita, and Rav Chanan bar Bizna was the judge there, and he said, yes, you can go and collect those slaves. Amar lehu Rav Nachman, zilu ahaduru, vila magbinan lechu le'apad naichu. However, Rav Nachman went and told them, go and return those slaves. You ruled incorrectly, and if you don't do it, then I'm going to collect it from your own mansions. I'm going to make you judges pay for it yourselves, because Rav Nachman disagreed. He said he thought that you cannot have a lien on a slave. Slaves are not like land, and you ruled incorrectly. Amar Rav Nachman. Rava later on told Rav Nachman, Ha Ula, Ha Rabbi Elazar, Ha Dayaner de Nahar De'ah, Veha Rav Hanan bar Bizna. Mor keman svira le. Tough question. Rav says to Rav Nachman, why are you saying that they have to return the slaves? Behold, we have so many people who think that slaves are like land, right? You have Ula, he said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, you have the judges from the Harda, you have Rav Hana bar Bizna and Pumbedita. So actually, that seems to be the majority. Rav Nachman, who are you following to disagree with so many people? Amale ana matitaya da'na detane abimi peroz bol hal al kakarka veno hal al ha'abadim betartelim niknin im hakarka ve'enan niknim im ha'abadim. Rav Nachman says, what are you kidding? You're bringing me these amoraim? I have a baraita that supports me, because there's a baraita that is taught by Avimi. It says, a peroz bol. This is a document that I submit to the judges so that I can collect a loan through the Shavi'it. Normally, Shavi'it would come and cancel the loan. If we enact a peroz bol, then I don't have to. But here's the thing: peroz bol can only work if there is land that is owned by the borrower, right? The borrower has to own land for a peroz bol to work. The reason seems to be that the way the peroz bol work is that he owes me money, and now if he has land, so then I have a lien on that land, and I could submit the lien to the judges, right, to register. And so therefore it's kind of like the judges are already collecting that loan, and now I have ownership over that piece of land. So it's not that he owes me money anymore. I actually have ownership over his land. So Shemitah does not cancel my ownership over land. And so peroz bol kind of effectuates that lien and makes that lien registered with the judges, so that I already in effect have ownership over his land, and that's the mechanism of peroz bol. But that can only work if the borrower has land. If the borrower doesn't have land, then I can't create a lien and to submit to the judges to turn that lien into an ownership of the land. It wouldn't work. So Actually, today, if you want to make a pidus bol and the guy that owes you money doesn't own land, what you can do is actually gift him a small piece of land. It could be even 1 by 1 inch. It doesn't have to be an equivalent. It doesn't have to be a large piece that's equivalent to the amount of money. It's more symbolic. Actually, gift him a little bit of land, and then I can make a pidus bol. And then the loan would not be canceled. That's number one. And pidus bol, you can do that for land, but you cannot write a pidus bol on a slave. Even if he owns slaves, I can't write a pidus bol on a slave. You see, according to this braita, slaves are not like land. And a second way that they're not like land, that movable items can be bought together with land. This is called kinyan agav. I buy land from you, and I say I'm going to take the furniture too. So once I make an acquisition, I do an act to acquire the land. So the movables come together with it. I don't have to make a separate transaction for the movable items. We're going to discuss later whether the movable items have to be on the land or even if they're not on the land. Like if it's furniture that's on the property, then for sure it works. But what if it's like a car that's in the street and I want to buy that car, agav, the land, does that work also? The conclusion is that in fact does. But we'll see that in a minute. So movable items can be bought agav karka, but the movable items cannot be acquired agav avadim. If I buy your slaves and your vase, so I have to make a separate transaction to acquire the slaves, and then the vase I have to go and physically pick it up, do an act of acquisition for it. So you see here again that slaves are like movable items. Slaves are not like land. So Rav Nachman says here, I have a baraita. Don't quote to me all these amoraim. I have a good source to say they are not. All right. So now we understand that there's a serious machloket between Rav Nachman, who says slaves are not like land, and all these other opinions that says they are. But now Rav Nachman has a baraita to support him. What about all the other opinions? So we're going to say le'ma ketanaeh. Let's propose that actually this is not only a machloket amoraim, it's also machloket among tanaim. Because look, we have two baraitot here. We already saw one baraita. And now we're going to have two more that contradict each other. Machar lo avadim v'karkaot. Hechazik ba'avadim lo kana karkaot. B'karkaot lo kana avadim. If someone sells both slaves and land, if the buyer takes possession of the slaves, he still does not take possession of the land. And similarly, if he takes possession of the land, he does not take possession of the slaves. We're going to come back to this law regarding the relationship between slaves and land, and we'll explain why slaves don't come along with land. Because actually there's a law that if I buy multiple pieces of land and I acquire one of them, then I acquire all the rest of them also. So that applies to two pieces of land, but does not apply to slave and land. Okay, so we're going to come back to this, but here's the main thing that we're focusing on now. The relationship between land and movable items. If I acquire the land, I also acquire agav, movable items. But if I acquire movable items, and I take possession, I pick up the furniture, but I didn't do an act of acquisition on the land, it does not go. You can't do kinyan agav on metaltelin and thereby acquire land. You can only do it if I acquire land, then agav, I get the metaltelin. Now, let's compare avadim u'metaltelin, slaves and movable items. Hechazik ba'avadim lo kana metaltelin, metaltelin lo kana avadim. They are not connected. Just because I made an acquisition on slaves, I do not get agav, the movable items, nor if I do an acquisition of movable items, I do not get the slaves. So what you see here is that slaves are not like land. With land, I can use land for kinyan agav and get metaltelin, but avadim, I cannot use avadim to acquire movable items with kinyan agav. So this supports Rav Nachman, right, and supports this baraita also. So we have here two baraitot and the opinion of Rav Nachman. Slaves are not like land. However, all the other amoraim can follow this baraita. V'hatanya hechazik ba'avadim kana metaltelin. In fact, I can. If I'm acquiring from you both slaves and some furniture, once I take possession of the slave, I make him work, or I bring him into my possession. Then agav, I also get the metartelin. This shows that slaves are like land, and so this would seem to be a machloket tanaim, right? Ma'ila behakami palge. Demor savar abadim kemikarke dame, umar savar abadim kemetartelin dame. Seems that the essence of the machloket is that the second baraita thinks that slaves are like land, so that's why you can do kinyan agav with slaves, because the same law as land. And the first baraita follows is like the opinion of Rav Nachman, that slaves are like movable items, right? So is that the only way and best way to interpret this? Amar Rav Ika b'red Rav Nameh. So Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ameh, is going to say not necessarily. It could be that we can reconcile the braitot. It would be nice if we can reconcile the braitot. We're going to have two versions of Rav Ika. He's going to reconcile both of them one way, and then he's going to reconcile both of them the other way. In fact, in fact, everyone agrees that slaves are like land, and therefore the braita that says you can use them for kinyan agav, that makes perfect sense. That's the second braita. And the first braita, v'hata detanya lo kana, bainan karka dumya de ari mesurot bihuda de la naide. Even though in the first braita considers slaves to be like land, because there we just said everyone agrees that slaves are like land. That's true regarding a lien, that you can have a lien on slaves just like I could have a lien on land. But when it comes to kinyan agav, no, that doesn't work, because in order to achieve a kinyan agav, you need land that is similar to that described in the following pasuk in Divrei Yamim. It talks about fortified cities in Judea that don't move. Kinyan agav can only work with land that doesn't move. That's actual land, whereas slaves are like land, but they move. Now, what is this pasuk talking about? Well, it appears in the discussion of the following Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin. Ditnan, Nechasim she'en lahem achrayut niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut bekesef ub'shtar ub'chazaka. Mina hanamileh, amar Chizkiah de'amar Kera, vayiten lahem abihem matanot rabot lechesef ulzahab ulmigdanot Aim are mesurot bihuda. Mishnah Kiddushin talks about kinyan agav and says property that cannot use for a guarantee, meaning movable items, can be acquired agav together with property that you can use for a guarantee, meaning land, and you can do that with money, with a contract, or with physically taking possession. In other words, if you complete a transfer of land using kesef shtar chazaka, which are always you can use to transfer land, then you automatically get agav the metartelin. Now, and that was the Mishnah. Now, how do you know that? Like kesef, for example, you can only use to acquire land. Transfer of money does not effectuate the transfer of movable items. But if you transfer land, then you get the movable items. Now, that was the Mishnah. And how do you know that? We asked. Chizkiah brought a source. This is from Divrei Yamim, talking about King Yehoshaphat. He gave things to his sons. And it says that the father gave them gifts, silver, gold, precious items. Those are all movable items. And it says, together with, meaning agav, cities that were fortified in Judea. So you can do it with cities that are fortified, meaning not movable things. You can do kinyan agav. But you cannot do it with movable land, meaning slaves, does not work. And so this opinion would say, so in fact, Rav Ika says, everyone agrees that, so it's not really based on this machloket, are slaves like land? It could be that both baraitot agree that slaves are like land when it comes to doing a lien. And that would be the majority of Amoraim above, Ula, Rabbi Elazar, and so on. But nevertheless, when it comes to Kinyan Agav, there's a machloket between these two baraitot. One baraita says, yes, it works. Since it's like land, you can do kinyan agav, and the other baraita says, well, even though it's like land for liens, but when you want to do kinyan agav, it has to be something that doesn't move, so you can't use a slave. That's all one version of the reconciliation. Ika de amre, amarav Ika bered Rav Ami. Tekule alma avde kimetaltelin dame. Vehade tanya lo kana shapir. So the second version says, in fact, both Baraita agree that slaves are like movable items. In other words, this is Rav Nachman's opinion. And therefore, the Baraita that says it does not work, that would make sense. That's the first Baraita. You can't do kinyan agav because slaves are like movable items. Had tanya kana beodan alav. And the one that says that you can acquire it, that's talking about where the movable items are actually on the slave. The slave is holding those movable items. That's why it doesn't work through kinyan agav, but rather like a courtyard. My courtyard is like an extension of my own hand. If you throw something into my courtyard, I acquire it. Even if I'll say courtyard I own for years. You put something in my courtyard, now it's mine, right? Amazon delivers a package and puts it on my porch or in my courtyard, so it's mine. You can't go and take it. And so a slave is the same as a courtyard, and therefore it only works if it's actually, if he's holding it. So that's what the second Baraita means when it says that a slave can acquire something. It's not as kinyan agav, but rather it's acquiring something as a courtyard. But now we ask about that. V'chiodan alav mayhaveh. Even if the movable items are being held by the slave, still, can that work as a courtyard? It's a moving courtyard, and we have a rule that a moving courtyard cannot acquire something as a courtyard. Oh, so maybe you'll say the slave is not walking, he's standing in one place, so he's a non-moving courtyard. Rava said anything that potentially can move, can walk, cannot acquire. Anything that, if it were walking, cannot acquire something, even if it's standing or sitting, also cannot acquire something. Even if it can potentially move, it has to be something that is stationary, a stationary courtyard, like one that's in the ground. That works, but something that can possibly move does not acquire as a courtyard, even if it's not moving currently. So it doesn't help if he's standing. So the answer is, we're talking about a slave that's bound up and therefore unable to walk. So he's bound up and he has some movable items on top of him. And I acquire that slave. In that case, I can acquire the movable items along with it as a courtyard, but not as kinyan agav. And that's how we can explain that Mishnah, that Baraita, according to this opinion. This is all the second Ika de Amre, that everybody agrees that slaves are like movable items, so it's not working as kinyan agav. The second Baraita is talking about acquiring something, acquiring movable items through a courtyard, the slave being like a courtyard when he's bound up. All right, good. So that's the two ways of resolving the two Baraitot. But now we bring another Baraita that is going to talk about the relationship between a slave and land. The first Baraita above said that if I acquire a land, it does not acquire a slave. And if I acquire a slave, it does not acquire land, agav. But this Baraita says that if I acquire land, I can acquire the slaves, agav, with kinyan agav, by acquiring the land. So we have a contradiction between the first Baraita and this Baraita. How can we explain this? So this is a separate discussion from is slaves like land or like movable items. Here we're just talking about acquiring the slave with land, and that is a contradiction. So we answer hatam be'omedim betocha. Over here where it says it does work, that when I acquire the land, I acquire the slave. That's when the slave is standing in the land, and so then I acquire the slave through the land as a courtyard, but not as kinyan agav. And the first Baraita above, when it says it doesn't work, that's when the slave is not on the land, and so it cannot work as a courtyard, and kinyan agav does not work from land to a slave. Now, miklal dehai lo kana kishe'enomdim betocha. Okay, so that means that in the Baraita above, when it says it doesn't work, that's talking about when the slave is not standing on the land, and kinyan agav does not work for that. Well, let's see. Does that make sense? Hainu de'i omdim betocha in ila la. So this assumption that the slave is not on the land would make sense according to the second Ika Amre above, where Rav Ika Bered Rav Ameh says that slaves are like movable items. And since slaves are like movable items, that's why it makes sense if it's on the land, it works. If it's not on the land, it doesn't work. Since slaves are like movable items, how do movable items work with kinyan agav? Kinyan agav only works if the movable items are on the land. Like furniture that's on the land, I acquire the land, I acquire the furniture. Right now, we're assuming that if the movable items are not on the land, like my car that's in the street, it does not work. I cannot acquire the car with the land. And so that would be consistent since, according to that, the second Ika de Amre, of Rav Ika, it says slaves are like movable items. So then, yes, they're both the same. It has to be on the land in order for the kinyan agav to work. Ela lehachli shana. We're going to question this in a minute. Ela lehachli shana damar avde kemekarkae dame lama li omdim betocha hama Shmuel machalo eses sadot be'esem medinot kevan shechzik b'achad mehen kanakulan. But according to the first statement of Rav Ika, who said that slaves are like land, why does it matter? Why do the slaves have to be standing on the land? Shmuel, after all, said a ruling regarding land only, that if I am buying 10 pieces, someone sells me 10 plots of land in all different places, in all different countries, as long as I make an acquisition on one of them, I go and lock the gate and use one of them, I acquire all of them. So here's a special law regarding land, that when you acquire one piece of land, you can acquire all of them. Now, if you say, and it goes according to this opinion that says slaves are like land, then it should be the same thing. Just like I can acquire one piece of land by making an acquisition on the other, and then I have to go to all 10, so too, that should work for slaves, no matter where they are. If I acquire land and slaves together, and I do an active acquisition on one piece of land, I should be able to acquire slaves, even if they're in different countries, just like I can acquire through that act land that's in different countries. So according to this version, why does it matter if it's in the land or not? How would you explain that first baraita? So then we say, wait, wait a second. I want to go back. This is a good question you asked, but I want to go back to your assumption here that if slaves are like movable items, then yeah, it makes sense, has to be in it and not, right? According to you, according to that, in the version that says slaves are like movable items, then according to that, why does it have to be on the land? In Masechet Kiddushin, where we talked about this whole discussion, we actually concluded that movable items do not need to be piled up on the land that I'm acquiring. If I acquire land and you also have movable items in some other place, like your car in the street or anything somewhere else, it doesn't have to be piled up on the land, like the furniture on the land or wheat on the land. It could be anywhere, and kinyan agav works even if it's not on the land. And so therefore, actually, even in your assumption of the question, your assumption here doesn't make sense. Either way, even if it's kimetal teleh, it should not have to be on the land. It should be able to work. Ela. So rather, I'll answer your question, and then the question I asked about you, and then that will work for me as well. Ela mai itlach lememad shan mitartele denaide mitartele delainaide. So it must be that we have to say there's a difference between movable items that move on their own, meaning slaves, and movable items that don't move on their own, like furniture and grain. The difference being that if it doesn't move on its own, then I can acquire the movable items agav land because they're stationary, right? They're in one place. We can pin them down, and that's okay. I can acquire that the car, the brand, whatever, somewhere else with the land. But if it's a movable item like slaves, then the slaves are harder to pin down and they need their own act of acquisition, and I cannot do the slaves, acquire the slaves agav the land, right? And so necessarily you'll have to make a distinction even according to that opinion that says that slaves are like movable items. So you know what? I will also make a distinction. Even if you say that slaves are like land, but nevertheless, land that moves, meaning slaves, is not the same as land that doesn't move. Slaves are land that moves, whereas land itself that doesn't move is all part of one mass of earth. That's why it works according to Shemuel. When I make an acquisition on one piece of land, that land is connected. It's one block of earth. And so it's connected to all the other pieces of land, even though they're in different countries and different parts of the earth, but they are all physically connected to each other. And that's why an act of acquisition on one is effective for the others. But slaves that move around are not part of one physical block of one physical mass. And that's why, in fact, does make a difference for Shemuel's law, and acquiring land over here does not take effect on slaves. And so either way, we can explain that braita, last braita that we just brought, that says kinyan for land works for slaves. That's only if the slave is on the land. Then yes, then it'll work as a courtyard. But if the slave is not on the land, according to all opinions, there is a distinction between whether you say slaves are like land or like movable items. Still, there's a distinction when it comes to acquiring a slave agav land. Only if the slave is on the land, it works as a courtyard. But it's not going to work through means of agav or through means of it being one mass. That works. That will not work to acquire a slave with the land. That brings us to the next part of the Mishnah that says, Nechasim she'en bahen me'ilah. I am liable to pay damages for your property only if it's property for which I would not be liable for me'ilah, misuse, if I used it. So therefore, if you have a korban olah, which is kodashim, kodshe kodashim, a korban olah animal that's designated to be a korban olah. If I use it for personal purposes, then I'm liable me'ilah. If I cause damage to that animal, I am not liable to anyone, to the person that designated it, to who has it, or anyone else. Okay, so that's the rule of the Mishnah. Now we infer me'ilahu deletbe ha mikdash kodshe. What if it's a type of item that I'm not liable to me'ilah, but it is holy? There's two levels of holiness. Kadashim kalim, like a korban shelamim. If I partake of or use an animal that's only kodashim kalim while it's alive, once it's slaughtered by a kohen in the Bet HaMikdash, then I am chayab me'ilah if I partake of it. Partake from a forbidden part of it. But while it's alive, it's only kodashim kalim and is not liable to me'ilah. So from the fact that the Mishnah says I am liable if there's no me'ilah, it means that if there's no me'ilah, even if there's no me'ilah, but it is hekdesh, I am still liable. No mantana, who is the author of this Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Yochanan bekadashim kalim ve'alibad Rabbi Yosef Galili damar mamon ba'alim hu. So Rabbi Yochanan explains the Mishnah is talking about an example of kodashim kalim, like a korban shelamim or bechor while it's alive. That's kodashim kalim, and according to the Bioseh Galili, while it's kodashim kalim no matter the whole time, while it's alive and while it's slaughtered. But here's the thing: according to Bioseh Galili, while it's alive, it belongs to the owner. If you say designate an animal to be a korban shelamim, that's kodashim kalim, you still own it monetarily, even though it's designated, you have to eventually sacrifice it, but it's still your property. Therefore, if I cause damage to your korban shelamim while it's alive, according to the Bioseh Galili, since it's your property, I have to pay. only if it's and korban olah, then I wouldn't have to pay. Or once it's actually sacrificed, and you're still doing the avodah before the blood is sprinkled, then it becomes chayav to me'ilah. After the blood is sprinkled, some parts are put on the mizbech and some parts go back to the owner to eat in Jerusalem. At that point, it becomes, well, we'll see what happens at that point. Okay, so this is the answer according to this Mishnah. Must be to be Galili, who says that Kodashim Kalim, while it's alive, is the ownership, is the property of the owner, and therefore I am liable. De Tanya. And now here's the source of the Biyasa Galili. The Tanya, Ma'ala Ba'al Ba'Hashem, L'rabot Kodashim Kalim, Shen Mamonot Ibre Rabbi Yoseh Galili. This pasuk is talking about Korban Asham, that I have to bring if I swear falsely about money, a monetary matter, and I'm lying, then I have to bring a Korban Asham. This pasuk is curious because it says Ma'ala Ba'al Ba'Hashem. Wait, but Korban Asham is only if I am trying to steal money from another person. Ben Adam Lachavero. So why does it say Ma'al Ba'Hashem? Rabbi Yosef explains it's coming to include something that's Kodashim Kalim. So if you have a Korban Shelamim and you entrust it to me to watch, and then I go and swear falsely that, oh, no, you never gave it to me, or I already gave it back to you, I don't owe it to you. And so that is both it requires Korban Hashem because it was your property, and it also is a sacrificial animal, so that's why it's both Ben Adam Lachavero and Ben Adam Lamakom. That's why it says Ma'al Ba'Hashem. The point is that even though you designated it as a sacrifice, because it's only Kodashim Kalim, it's still your property, and that's why it is considered stealing, and therefore that's the source of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. All right, so now we understand the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, while I would not be liable if I hurt your animal that is chayab me'ilah, but I am liable if I hurt your animal that's only a shelamim while it's alive. Here's the thing: we have a contradictory Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin. HaMekadesh bechelko, ben bekodshei kodashim, ben bekodashim kalim, ena mekudeshet. Lema dela k'Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. If a kohen does Kiddushin to a woman using a part of an animal, of a sacrificial animal, whether it's kodshei kodashim or kodashim kalim, the Kiddushin is no good. So why not? If it's kodashim kalim, you just said that kodashim kalim, according to the Biyaseh Galili, belongs to the owner. So this should be the property of the kohen, and therefore, if he gives it to a woman, the kiddushin should be good. So should we say that this Mishnah is not the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili, even though our Mishnah here in Baba Kama is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili? So we answer Afilu Tema Rabbi Yosef Galili. We can even reconcile this and say it is his opinion. Ki amar Rabbi Yosef Galili mehayim, aval lachar shechita afilu Rabbi Yosef Galili modeh techi kazachu mishulchan gaboa kazachu. When Rabbi Yosef Galili says that a kodashim kalim belongs to the owner, that's while it's alive, before it's slaughtered. But after it's slaughtered, then even the Biyosei Galili would agree that when the Kohen gets a part of it, or the owner gets a part of it, then he's partaking from the table of the Most High. In other words, when some guy comes and takes an animal and makes it korban shelamim, he still belongs to him. When it's slaughtered, then it's prohibited to anyone, and anyone would be chayab me'ilah. That's during the processing of the avodah, from the time of slaughter until the blood is sprinkled. After the blood is sprinkled, and then kodashim kalim, most of it is eaten by kohanim and by the owners. At that point, they are granted part of it, but it's not because it belongs to them. Once it's sacrificed, it belongs to Hashem, and Hashem says, you can share with me in eating this item, but it still doesn't belong to him. And that explains this Mishnah here, when it's talking about kodashim kalim, is talking about after shechita, and that's why even according to Biyosei Galili, it's not the Kohen's property, and the kiddushin is no good. But if it was when it was alive, if someone gives a live shelamim animal to a woman and says "Remikudeshet li" with this, then the kiddushin would be okay. Now we ask once again, Mechayim mi amar, is it true that Rabbi Yosef Galili said that if while Kodshei Kalim, Kadashim Kalim are alive, it belongs to the owner? Here we have a contradiction from another Mishnah in Masechet Maaser Sheni. Vatanan Bechor mochrin oto tam chai velo shachut u'ba'al mum chai v'shachut mekadeshin bo et ha'isha. You have a bechor, a firstborn animal, is a type of kodashim kalim. Now, if it's unblemished, then it's supposed to be sacrificed. I'm not a kohen, and I have a bechor bechor animal born in my herd, I have to give it to a kohen. Now, the kohen, he's supposed to sacrifice it, and then he gets part of it back. While it's alive, he's allowed to sell it. He can sell to another kohen, and he can take the money. That's permitted. If they did shechita, then it's not allowed. If you did shechita outside the Bet HaMikdash, the whole thing is prohibited. If you did it in the Bet HaMikdash, then it already becomes chayab me'ilah, and then he wouldn't be able to sell it either. Now, if it gets a blemish, an animal that gets a blemish, I still have to give to the kohen, but the kohen is allowed to slaughter it and eat it. And so, if it has a blemish, whether it's alive or if he did shechita outside the Bet HaMikdash, it belongs to him, and therefore he can use it to do kiddushin with to a woman. Now, so far, this is consistent with Rabbi Yosef Galili, because this bechor, when it's alive, right, he's allowed to sell it. Whether it has tam or not tam, it belongs to him. So far, this would be consistent. The problem is the following statement. V'amar Rav Nachman amar Rabba bar Abu, lo shanu ela bechor bezman hazeh, techivan de'la chazil hakrava, it lehu lekohanim zechiya begavayhu. Ava bezman shebet hamikdash kayam, techazi lehakrava, la. Rav Nachman said that this Mishnah only applies nowadays. In his days, he's an Amorah living way after the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. Since we can't sacrifice it anymore, so the Kohen gets it, and it's his property. But when the Bet HaMikdash was up, where in that case the Kohen, if it's tam, would have to sacrifice it, he would not be able to sell it. It would not belong to him. Only nowadays, if you have a bechor tam nowadays, then you have to actually just wait till it gets a mum. What we actually do in practice nowadays on kosher farms is we do some kind of joint ownership with a non-Jew, and therefore we're not chayav in bechor. But if you don't do that, then you have to just wait till it walks past some thorns and gets a blemish. But either way, the Kohen eventually will be able to eat it. Because it's not possible to sacrifice. So we consider it, it's already yours now. You can do kiddushin. But in times of the Bet HaMikdash, you would not be able to. So you see that this is against the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili. Ve'iti be'rava l'Rav Nachman. All this is part of the discussion over there of that Mishnah. Uma'ala ma'al ba'Hashem l'rabot kodshei kodashim shem mamonot Rabbi Yosef Galili. And that's exactly what Rava challenges Rav Nachman with. This is what do you mean? Why are you saying that in the time of the Bet HaMikdash he wouldn't be able to sell it or use it for kiddushin? After all, look at this baraita that according to the Rabbi Yosef Galili, kodashim kalim, he learns this from this pasuk, it does belong to him, so he should be able to sell it and use it for kiddushin even in the time of the Bet HaMikdash. Umeshanerev Ravina, and in that discussion, Ravina answered, "Bebechor bechutz haaretz v'albad Rabbi Shimon damar im ba'u temimim yikarebu, im ba'u in lechatechila la." Ravina answered over there that the baraita of Rabbi Yosef Galili, this here Rabbi Yosef Galili's opinion, that says it's your belongs to you, the owner of the animal of a kodashim kalim, it's your mammon. That's only regarding a bechor that was born outside the land of Israel, and we're assuming the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who said that if you have an unblemished bechor that came from outside the land of Israel and someone brought it into Israel, then fine, we'll sacrifice it in times of Bet HaMikdash. That's all. So we see from that, only if it already came. B'di'avad, okay, we'll sacrifice it. But lechetechila, if it was born outside the land of Israel, don't bring it to Israel. Just leave it outside the land of Israel and wait till it gets a blemish, and then eat it over there. So you see that according to Ravina's explanation here, Rabbi Yosef Galili only says it's your mammon when it's outside the land of Israel. Now, why did he say that? V'im ita techi amar Rabbi Yosef Galili mamono hu mechayim lishne had Rabbi Yosef Galili had Rabbanan. If in fact Rabbi Yosef Galili thinks that it belongs a Kodashim Kalim animal belongs to the owners while it's alive, so he could have answered much more simply that. This is Ravina could have answered much more simply that this is the opinion of that this Baraita is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili, who says while it's alive, it's permitted. It is your ownership, and therefore the Kohen who owns it can sell it or do Kiddushin with it. Whereas the Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbanan, who say that even Kodashim Kalim does not belong to the owner, it already belongs to Gavoa. So you could have answered this contradiction much more easily, rather than having to say, oh, Rabbi Yosef Galili is only talking about a Bechor that's from outside the land of Israel. So now we're questioning the entire premise that we started with, that according to Rabbi Yosef Galili, and a live Kodashim Kalim animal is permitted. And so we answer, Amale matanot keuna kamat, shane matanot keuna dechi kachazu, meshulchan gavoa kachazu. The answer is you can't compare something that's a gift to the Kohen, like a Bechor, with something else like a Korban Shelamim. A gift to the Kohen, a gift that's already designated to Kohen, like a Bechor, the second it's born, it already is the property of, it already has to be given to the Kohen. And therefore, it's already sanctified, rather. It's already sanctified from the second it's born. And the Kohen, he's the one that gets to take it and sacrifice it if it's tam, or eat it himself if it has a mum. So you can't compare a Bechor to other cases of Kodashim Kalim, like a Shelamim. When it comes to a Bechor, the fact that the Kohen can eat it, yes, true, he can eat it, but it belongs to the Most High. Because it's sanctified already from birth, it belongs to the Most High. A Bechor is not the property of a Kohen. That's why we had to, Ravina had to say over here, when it comes to a Bechor, only a Bechor outside the land of Israel would be able to be sold or used for Kiddushin, because it's not sacrificable. But if it's in the land, but if it is in the land of Israel at a time of the Bet HaMikdash is up, then Rabbi Yosef Galili would agree that this is Shulchan Gavoa, you can't use it. But that's a special law for Bechor. When it comes to other Kodashim Kalim, like a regular animal that's born, plain old chulin animal, that I sanctify and make a Korban Shelamim, in that case, although I made it a Korban Shelamim, I, the owner, still own it as property, as my mammon, and that's a case where you could use it for Kiddushin, you could sell it, and if it gets damaged, the damager has to pay for those damages, because this is all according to Rabbi Yosef Galili. While it's alive, it does in fact belong to the owners. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.